Hello folks, welcome back to another exciting Kent Models video. On this video I'm going to go through the basics of cementing and gluing parts to your model, removing parts off of the sprue, and some other little tips and tricks that might help you. As always, this is geared towards the beginner to try to fill in a few gaps here and there. So any of the seasoned model makers amongst us, forgive me for the basic nature of this video. However, you never know, you might pick up some bits and pieces for yourself. To start with, obviously you get in a kit, everything comes on a sprue. So all of the parts, as you would have seen in one of the other videos, all come on this plastic sprue, and we need to take these parts off, glue them together, paint them to assemble the car or the bike or whatever we're making. So a couple of quick intros to tools. So now we've made it easy on beginners in that we've got a complete novice set of equipment that you need. So you can buy a car or a bike, buy that kit, and you get everything you need, which is going to be glue, it's going to be your nippers, there's going to be a basic modelling knife, some tweezers, a cutting mat, and some glue and a packet of brushes. So if you get that kit, happy days, brilliant, excellent. So first things first, the sprue itself. So what you can do, is very tempting to do, is to seal your parts on the sprue and think, oh that's right, I'll just paint them all while they're on the sprue, they're all there, great. Well, that's fine and all. So for example, this white sprue, if we wanted to paint everything on there black, we do that and it'll dry, and you think, oh that's good, I've saved myself a load of time in handling all these little bits and pieces. But of course, when you come to cut them out, there's obviously all the pieces that you've cut out that suddenly aren't painted, so you only have to go back and retouch them back in again. So sometimes it's okay to do that, but other times not so much. So personally, and it is personal preference, what I prefer to do is to cut the parts from the sprue, assemble them if they're things that have got to go together, and then just hold them and then paint them afterwards. So a big thing, of course, with any kind of plastic kit is the more glue and assembly you can do before you actually paint something, the better it's going to be, because no matter what glue it is, it just lifts the paint off of the surface. So you're always better on gluing as much as possible and then going about your paint. Now it's not always possible, but what you need to do, of course, is when you get your kit, it comes with comprehensive instructions, which obviously details what goes where and what colours it needs to be and all this kind of stuff. So the most common thing to do, of course, for a newbie, is to start at the beginning, which you would do if you were assembling an IKEA, bookshelf, and go through it. But model making is slightly different. They give the step-by-step instructions. However, most of us are quite keen on making sure the model comes out, as realistic as possible. So what we need to do is be a bit cute. So before you start doing anything, is have a look at the instructions, look at the different steps that are involved in the kit, and work out which bits you can actually assemble and glue together in advance, and possibly paint them in advance of actually assembling them. So the big one to be concerned with about that, for a car, for example, is the body. So as you can see with this particular GTR kit, this is a good example my son and I have been making. For one reason or another, we're going to use this as the donor kit for a couple of videos. You can see that this kit is almost, the exterior is almost fully assembled. Now, if you followed the instructions in the kit, it wouldn't look like this at all at this stage. So what we did was we took the front bumpers, the rear bumpers, these over fenders, the side mirrors and bits and pieces, and we glued it all together first, looking at the instructions, making sure we could, and then we set about preparing the body and painting it. So that means is that it's now painted and it's all assembled, and we haven't had to go around and start gluing things on and smudging the glue and effectively smudging the paint. So the moral to that story is glue whatever you can in advance, and it might be out of sequence with the instructions, but do as much as you can, glue it together, and then set about painting it, if you can. As I say, it's not always possible, but 9 times out of 10, it is going to be possible. So you can see in this kit, we've actually gone a bit more advanced than that, and we've painted some bits and pieces, and we've put some lights in it and so on. But for the purposes of what we're talking about, of assembly and glue, if you can glue everything and get to that kind of stage before you've even assembled the chassis, then you're winning. So if we was to apply glue to this in anywhere on here, then the glue is just going to smudge it, as I said, and you would have found that out, I guess, if you've already built a kit. So respecting what bits need to be glued before you paint them is a big part of it, and ultimately you're going to get a better finish. So just talking about glues for the moment, so if you go onto our website, there's generally 4 different glues that you can buy. They're not always on the site because sometimes they sell out and we can't get them because they come from Japan, but there's 4 different types, and the reason that there's 4 is that there's 2 from Mr. Hobby, which we happen to think is, you know, the brand that we should be dealing with all of our parts, whether it be glues or paints or whatever. And then there's Tamiya, which is everybody, you know, not even non-model makers understand Tamiya. Over the years, they've done a great job marketing themselves, so everyone kind of knows what Tamiya is. So for most people, Tamiya is a safe bet in terms of a brand that means quality. Whereas sometimes Mr. Hobby, it's like, never heard of that before. But actually, they're just as good as each other. And there's very little differences between them. In actual fact, I happen to think, from using both types, that Mr. Hobby has got the slight edge over Tamiya. So if, like me, you used to put kits together in your youth, and your experience was buying your standard Tamiya cement from your local model shop that used to exist, you know, the one on the high street, then this is what you would have been presented with. And probably like me, you've got experiences of model making and having disasters on your hands where you've got this big sticky mess of a model and there's glue everywhere and it's all gludgy and everything else. So thankfully things have come on in this kind of technology now, and whilst you can still kind of get that normal gludgy glue, there's now also some thin cements that you can get, the thinner glues you can get, which personally I think are the way forward. So anything that sets quick and is thin is good in my books, and I'm going to show you in a minute how to do that. So these new videos that we're doing now is about showing you how we do it versus just showing you what these products are. Hopefully then obviously improving how you're putting the kits together, and as an end result having much more fun from doing it. So first off, when it comes down to your sprue, so these are essential items. So you've got your nippers, and you can get different grades and quality of those. Buy the best ones you can afford, you get the best results, like most things in life. And obviously a very sharp modelling knife. So to remove them from the sprue, it's very tempting not to have nippers and just to twist the bits off, which we've all done it as a kid. But what you'll do with that is sometimes you'll distort the plastic. So it's much easier to leave them in situ, get it as close and as flat as possible to the part you're nipping out, in this case an engine, and I'll turn it around and I'll nip them out, okay? So always only take one part out at a time. So now I've nipped it quite close, but there's still these little bits that need finishing off, and this is where your blade comes into play. So very, very carefully, obviously always cutting away from you and making sure you haven't got any bits of your body on the other side of it if you slip. Just trim away those extra bits of sprue. Don't go too crazy on it, otherwise what you'll end up doing is going in too far, and of course you've ruined the part and you've made a big dent in it as opposed to just trimming it away. Now this stage is extremely important, so like most things, the preparation is everything. So if you screw up this stage and you're not paying attention and you're kind of wishy-washy with it, then ultimately you ain't going to get a good finish on it, and you're going to see this through the paint and the primer and everything else. So that's now pretty much done. Now there's a couple of bits that are still a little bit rough on it, and then what we can also have got obviously is a set of files. So we do something which is our own little brand, which is Hyper, and these are Hyper files, so you get 3 in a packet. So just where I've trimmed that down, if I wanted to get a bit crazy with it, I could also just file it and make sure there's no hairy bits of plastic that are coming off of it. Again, they're such a simple little tool, but invaluable for getting the best finish. So there we are. That's one side of the engine. Now I'll just quickly take off the other side of the engine because I want to show you a little technique about assembly and glue. So I'll do the same again. this is just a spare kit, so I'm not going to build this entirely, so I don't particularly care for the finish of it. So save you waiting on the video, I'll try to rush it through as quick as I can, just for the purposes of showing you some techniques. So, here we go. So these are my two parts that are ready to be assembled. And I've chosen this because it's so easy to see on the camera as to what this actual part is. So, what model maker would normally have you believe is what you do is like your super glue. You get hold of your glue, you put it on both sides, you stick it together, you hold it with your hands, and you get a big sticky blobby mess. That's generally most people's experience of model making as a kid, and maybe even now, I don't know. But as I said, things have moved on a little bit further, and what you can do now instead of doing that is, because of these extra thin glues. So we'll do a little dry run of the assembly of this part to begin with, and I can notice already there's a part there that is stopping it from seating properly. So I'll trim it down and make sure it seats properly, which it now does. So, as I said earlier on, my preference is to use the extra thin cements, and that are also quick drying. So we'll put those two normal ones aside for the moment, and what we're left with is Tamiya extra thin quick drying and also Mr. Cement SP. Now we'll use Mr. Cement SP because I think that's the business. We may as well practice what we preach. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to apply the glue to both sides and then stick it together at all. Sometimes that's necessary, but when it doesn't have to be, there's another way of doing it. Now, because it's so thin, what we can do is simply offer up both parts together, he says, and then just dab the glue into the crack. Now what it's going to do is it's going to obviously fill that void, which is tiny to the eye, and it will soak straight into the crack. Now, as you can see, I'm not being particularly careful with this because I'm trying to rush it for the video. So, but what I've already done obviously is I've assembled the part, and I'm putting the glue on afterwards. So it's very difficult to obviously see on the camera, but what's happened, of course, is that the glue, where it's so thin and it dries so quick, is that it soaks straight into the crack of the two parts, and it's now assembled. Now, the interesting thing about doing that is, of course, if you were just to apply glue to both sides and stick it together, then you're going to use lots of glue, maybe too much. And also, if you're using something that's quick drying, by the time you've gone around and done it, it's already dried by the time you've done it. So by putting the two bits together, holding them together, and then just damping it on the crack, you've used a minimal amount of glue, you've made a minimal amount of mess, and it's together and done. So that's the beauty of the quick set stuff. Look, the part's ready, it's done. So obviously I'll still leave that to dry, and depending obviously what temperature your room is and everything else depends on what the drying time's going to be, but it's obviously for you to work out. But that part is pretty much ready to go. Okay. So now we've glued it, we could think about painting that. So if I wanted to just tidy up the edges a little bit, I can use just some finishing abrasive paper, and I could just tidy that up. Now obviously if it was something really rough I was dealing with, obviously I could use my file, and I could file it, and I could basically make that good. Equally, if it was a huge crack and a massive disparity in the joint, then I could use some Mr. Hobby putty, which is basically body filler for plastic model kits. It comes in a tube. So that's all prepared. So there we go, an easy tip for gluing two bits together is hold them together, put it down the crack. Real easy, very, very simple. Again, I can demonstrate it on this car. Now this is a classic example of that technique. So where you need free hands, I want to put this over fender on. If I was to glue that, I don't know where it's all going to go. So if I just offer it up and put it where I think it should go, and then just dab it in the crack. It's not messy at all. I put exactly the right amount on, and it's attached. So easy. Okay, so if you're one of these people that ends up with a big mucky mess of a model, think about quick setting thin glue and using the technique that I've just employed there. I'll put that back over there for a moment. On the subject of glues, there's also another product that we added recently from Mr. Hobby, which is this Mr. Glue applicator set. Now you can see it there. There's 3 different pens that go with it. Now what you can do is, instead of using the big brush that comes with the kit, with the glue, so for example, let's take a Tamiya. So we know the Tamiya's, obviously the brush is very big, and you can see how gloopy the glue is on Tamiya. And again, this is all personal preference. But what you can do is, this Mr. Glue applicator set comes with its own little palette. So now you can use these, dip them in. So now you've got a very fine applicator to be able to put on very detailed parts. And there's three different types. So you can see that, hopefully you can see in the video. So you've got very fine, a medium and a coarse version. So for pretty much all jobs, you're going to be able to use those things. Now these come in quite handy when, I don't know, maybe your eyes aren't as good as they could be, or you missed the shaky hand man. With a great big brush like that, you're going to struggle with detail. So if you're one of these people where you do end up with a big gluey mess, like I mentioned earlier on, this is something to consider, because they make the job far easier, much easier. So that's gluing for you. So there's nothing wrong with either one of these 4 glues, and it is down to personal preference. But if you are interested, in my opinion, then I would go for either the Mr. Cement SP or the Tamiya Extra Thin Cement as a personal choice. Much easier. Moving on from that, there's another another product I put in the picture here, which is kind of relevant, which is Mr. Masking Sole. Now, the Neo version, which is what this is a really interesting product and overlooked by a lot of people. So when it comes to masking up your model and doing your painting in bits and pieces, this essentially is liquid masking tape. So what you can do is you just put it on any surface. It's very gloopy, and if you can see it there, you put it on any surface where you don't want the paint to go, leave it to dry, and then you can paint over it, and then you've basically masked off an area. Now, in true Blue Peter fashion, here's one I made earlier. So you can probably see that this is the base of a car, and it looks very rough, but inside there I've just brush marked a load of paint over, but there's actually the Masking Sole Neo in there as well. So hopefully this is going to demonstrate how this works. So I'll take my tweezers. It's a big rubbery mess, and look what's happening. So that area is what I masked off with this. So essentially, if you've got parts of the car that you can't really use, or bike, or where it's going to be, you can't really use masking tape to get the right effect. Maybe it's angled, maybe it's it's a part of the car which is very difficult to deal with. Well, actually, you can brush that on and wait for it to dry, and then spray over it, and suddenly you've got this huge universal tool to be able to mask areas off. Now, it is mega useful, but anyway, for your next purchase, it may be worthwhile including some of that in there and just experimenting with that. Certainly experienced model makers will be using that as a matter of course. So that's the basics of gluing or taking parts from your sprue and obviously gluing them together. Now the other thing that I've missed out is this, which is a cutting mat. So it's a self-healing mat, it's double-sided, it comes with our novice kit, although you can buy it on its own. So what you can also do, of course, is you can cut things out on this, which saves obviously table getting ruined. So a classic example is going to be using it to take your decals off the sheet. So you can do it obviously with your knife, and you can cut them out, no problem at all. But the other thing you can also do sometimes when you need to cut something off a sprue that's very detailed is to put your sprue over the top of the cutting mat and actually use your modelling knife to be able to trim it and make a better job. So maybe it's a small part where you can't get your nippers in, you need to do it with a knife. So that's where this comes into play. It's also got some measurements on there for people that like to get creative. Now, another word of advice about the sprues is that once you've taken all the parts off, if you're someone who likes to get really creative with your models, keep the sprue. Because, for example, as we saw recently, people that make their own roll cages, suddenly you've got pieces of plastic to be able to weld together to make custom things. You know, I don't know, maybe you fancy making yourself a set of those Japanese exhaust pipes. I have no idea. But anyway, all of these things, very easy to throw them in the bin, but sometimes they can actually be quite useful. And also you can use them as a rig to hold things as well. So that's something to consider. Anyways, hopefully you found this interesting, and it obviously introduced you some different products, but also some small techniques about cementing and gluing your parts together, filing them and prepping them. So the next stage is going to be looking at preparing parts for paint, what paints we can use, some of the other bits and pieces that can make our life a bit easier in that whole process. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and it's given you some ideas for how to increase the quality of your own models. Thank you for watching.